Welcome to Property Quorum. As per usual, here we are yet again. It's Thursday rolled around 10 o'clock, and we are here to talk about all things property. And as you know, that there's been all sorts of shenanigans going on, so there's always something to talk about. And what I must draw your attention to, of course, is our head honcho, Hamish McLay of Search Convey, of course, Juliet Baboolal of gunnercooke, and of course, Chris Gilsenan of Route Home, all of which have a vested interest. Today we have a wonderful guest, Steve Day of the buildingsafetyscheme.org, which is a pressure group that create their own legislation. Quite impressive. I'm sure it'll be more impressive as we get to know him more. But today's topic, which I hope will stir up thoughts and perhaps even fisticuffs, the people trapped in flats, anxiety over fire risk, double question mark. So, as usual, I'm going to throw Hamish McLay mercilessly to the wolves. Hamish McLay, talk us through it.
Well, we have a situation arising, as we know, that it is ongoing. However, we have a new government, which has just actually sort of come in, and we're hopeful that this new government that's come in is actually going to listen to people. So we need to create a voice that they can actually hear. And one of the aspects which has been talked about, I didn't notice anybody speaking about it at all in the lead up to the election, as though there wasn't any importance attached to it. But there jolly well ought to be, because when we actually sort of look, Grenfell happened 7 years ago, and as a consequence, certain materials have been outlawed effectively because of a higher fire risk. And that in itself has been sort of quite damning. And as a result of which, we had a Building Safety Act come out, and certain materials are now banned and they cannot be used on future properties. Now, if they're deemed to be that dangerous and they're of high risk, why are they still allowed to stay on buildings? Now, nobody has mentioned that there's any intention, certainly within government circles, that anything has to be done about that. So we need to keep up an awareness and keep it in the minds of people, because the sad thing is, every day there's people waking up and they cannot guarantee the safety of their future for several reasons. And I think it really is time that something was done about it.
Juliet, this seems to be a stain on our national integrity, frankly, that we've let this go as long as it's gone.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the Grenfell was sort of the start of it. But, in addition to the anxiety that people have in terms of being in a home that is potentially subject to fire risk, you've got all sorts of other risks, sort of, the insurance element of it. If your insurer says, well, look, you're not compliant, there's some fine print here, and we're not going to insure that property until you do certain things, then, what happens in the interim? What happens when you try to sell your property and you're being told, well, actually, the incoming buyer can't secure a mortgage because you're not mortgage compliant, or you haven't satisfied the mortgagee's requirements, and you can't sell your property, so you're stuck with this. It's very expensive. It's very nerve-wracking, and I can just imagine. You see all these leaseholders coming on talking about the cost of cladding and trying to get these EWS1 certificates now,
Right.
complying with building regulations. So it's very expensive. So it's a mental burden as well as a financial one, and it does need to be fixed.
What is to do, Chris? Is this affecting you? Do you come across properties with this kind of cladding, outdated materials that are potentially hazardous?
Yeah. Recently, well, in the last few years, I remember going to look at a development down in Runcorn, a fairly recent one, and it all had the disastrous cladding on that was a problem. Quite a new build development as well, called the Decks, down just off the river in Runcorn, and
Wow.
The property, the thing that attracted me originally was, well, why are these properties selling for so cheap? And we're talking about £120,000 properties that were bottoming out and being traded around about 25 grand.
Oh,
Now,
shit.
yes, yeah. So there's a huge problem there, just a financial problem for the people who are in these properties, and they are literally locked into these properties financially. But they can't afford to they can't take a financial hit like that, trying to sell them on the open market. So they are physically and financially locked into these units until the situation gets resolved. They're paying for. I remember visiting this particular site and had undercroft parking, and it was all cordoned off, and they were having to pay for a fire warden that just patrolled the perimeter night by night. Just literally a man patrolling to make sure the building didn't spontaneously combust. That's not a way to live. That's a horrible position to be in.
This is craziness.
It's absolutely insane. And taking it back, there is a fault at some point. So that something has gone wrong somewhere in the process. So at some point in that manufacturing process, who on earth thought that combustible material should be put to the outside of a building? That doesn't make sense. So something has broken down somewhere in the supply chain, and there is fault to be placed at some point in that process. And I don't think it's something that the taxpayer should be picking up. I know that there is a sync fund that has been set up for certain types of cladding in the past. I don't think that's appropriate. I think we need to be going for the manufacturers, going for the developers, and going for their PI and holding them all to account.
Steve, welcome to the show, by the way, from the buildingsafetyscheme.org. You've obviously got some very strong views about this. Please, let forth.
Yes, well, I mean, my background is that I'm in one of those flammable flats. I got told to expect a £30,000 bill. And I decided to fight it because I thought, actually, something like your other guests are saying, there's something's gone wrong here. And we need consumer protection, and we shouldn't have to go through the courts. So I went through their route to compliance with building control, and I went through the BBA certificate, looked at the reports, and they breached on the installation. And then I got the cladding manufacturer Saint-Gobain to come and inspect their handiwork after telling them Barratt are blaming you. So I played them against each other. They came, spent 110 grand doing intrusive investigations and condemned Barratt's handiwork. They breached on render thickness, it was too thin. They breached on fire break fixings, it was meant to be metal. They used plastic on this flammable XPS, EPS cladding. And then you also had the dot and dab method of adhesive instead of the grid. And all of those three in ADB has a significant effect on the fire rating of the building. So it's not the materials here, it's the builders didn't install properly. They built something that didn't comply with regulations at the time of construction. So that got me thinking. So I was like, well, what happens about the internal walls then? Have they met building regs there? And it's the same issue. They were missing ablative bats. They had holes in the wall where they put.
Apologies, we seem to have lost
black.
Oh, there
Can
you
you
go.
still hear me?
Yes. Yes, keep going.
And so I found the same issues. So the going forward, just at Royal Artillery Quays, because that's where we are in Woolwich, we basically now have a situation where the Barratt signed the developer contract that Michael Gove put together, but now they're arguing that they should leave flammable material on our walls, flammable spandrel panels that are unidentified as per the fire risk assessment external wall document, and have no fire test evidence to say these flammable panels are safe to leave on. Yet they are arguing to leave them on, condemning us to an EWS 1B1 rating, which is a standard instituted by lenders and insurers because they don't trust builders to keep to regulations. And if you look at Royal Artillery Quays, you can see why. And I work in finance, so I can tell you it's about trust. The lenders and the insurers don't trust the builders to keep to regs. And what we've ended up with now is a face-off of Barratt, big fight, trying to get them to take flammable material off our buildings so we aren't condemned to permanently high insurance. And I'll just make this last one point. Property Mart wrote to the then Minister of State, Lee Rowley, which is the big estate agent body, and they said growing numbers of insurers are actually declining B1 rated buildings. So we may not even be able to get insurance after the remediation. So this whole B1 rating is very serious. Anyway, that's my initial thoughts.
My only response would be not just the insurance side. I would have thought is if you wanted to resell the thing, you're stuck in your own prison of someone else's design who doesn't even admit that it's a prison.
Well, you've got to find a very, very strong buyer to sort of look past the flammable panels that are being left on to offer you what you're asking for. They're going to want a huge discount. And also with the compartmentation, Barrett are only doing the remediation of the front doors, while the party walls extend, tens of meters into the flat, separating flats. They're not looking at those walls. So I'm getting a fire engineer to go and look at those walls with a special endoscopic tube camera.
Right.
So, we just don't trust. It's a breakdown of trust.
I'm going to throw it straight into Hamish. Hamish, we've actually got a message from Dave McCall. Makes you wonder how the likes of the NHS sign off these projects.
Sorry, I missed that.
Oh, he said it makes you wonder how the likes of NHBC sign these projects off.
This is one of my concerns, and I would have thought, we do have, strangely enough, we do have a challenge getting information from an awful lot of councils relative to the building regulations. They're one of the difficult things to get your hand on. And many councils, councils originally were responsible. Now it's been passed over to those inspectors that Dave just sort of mentioned. And somehow or other, they cannot be checking out the full validity of the materials that are sort of being used. And I would have thought that was the first point of call. Now, Steve has mentioned particularly the likes of Barrett, who are responsible for having created his building and sort of, if you like, sort of put the high risk materials in there. One would have thought with that knowledge, because all of the building inspectors must know about that now. Why aren't they checking out that particular sort of aspect of them?
Well, my thoughts are that this is a can open worms everywhere scenario. That the problem is the deeper you dig into that can, the more worms you're going to find. So I think that's why they're arguing about, let's leave this last bit on, because the amount of money it's going to take us to take all that off and make good afterwards, it's not worth the effort. So if we can persuade you just to have no open fires near it, we'll be fine. Well, it's ridiculous. Chris, you must come across this all the time. How do you mitigate against the fact that, let's go back to the ones you mentioned. They're selling them for 25, 30 grand. How much effort or money would it take to make them usable, do you think? Can you estimate?
Based on what our guest is saying, it sounds like the whole building needs condemning and just knocking down. It's just mind-blowing. So and you mentioned no fires in no open fires near flats. There was actually an incident not far from me, where I live in Liverpool, where some genius decided to have a barbecue on the 14th floor and just raised the top half of the building.
Sorry.
It's ridiculous. Yeah, it is. It really is ridiculous. But it's that level of just not thinking or not having awareness of what you're living in and the danger and the impact on other people. And imagine that in one of these buildings that was really combustible. That's just a terrifying situation for people to be in. Because you're in such close quarters as well. You're surrounded by other people and all their foibles and other thinking that they do, and the daft things that people can do. And yeah, it's a horrible, terrifying situation to be in.
Dave McCall has just made another comment. Ex-warranty provider understands technology. His says the problem is lack of inspection. What say you?
Yeah, that's absolutely fair. Yeah, it seems like the developers are getting away with murder, and literal murder. So I think they need to be dragged over the coals. Not just civil charges, but corporate manslaughter sorts of level of charges.
Well, while we're talking about charges, I need to throw our pet solicitor into the fray. Juliet, surely there's going to be lots of legal strictures here that all developers should be keenly aware of. But historical stuff, what do they do?
You know, you need regulation. I think, you know, where's the regulator in all of this? Someone's paid a premium, a high premium for a property, and all of a sudden overnight the value of that property has gone down, it's devalued. You know, the reality is if you've got this type of property and you need to shift it, your only potential buyer is a cash buyer, and they're going to want it dirt cheap, and they're not necessarily going to want to invest if the whole building is going to be condemned. So the reality is we're on a losing slope. You need regulation. You need people to go in there and actually, you know, test the walls, test the materials, etc. And that's not happening. I mean, how is it that, and I get it, the developers that we're talking about here have deep pockets, and these inspectors are clearly not independent, and they're told, look, just go in and sign something off, and they doing it. And what's the risk? The risk is people's lives ultimately, because you're chimping and, you know, on material that's been signed off. How can you use plastic when the spec says metal, for example? You know, when you have a planning permission, you've got conditions on that planning permission. You've got to apply to the local authority to have those conditions discharged. So you've got an inspector going in and reporting, etc. So is it that, you know, the inspectors need more regulation insofar as, look, if you've got it wrong, you name and shame these people. And Chris is absolutely right. Apart from people paying a civil fine, which people have deep pockets, they can pay those civil fines. But if it becomes a manslaughter charge, if someone dies, for example, if you owned a property as a landlord and you hadn't had a gas safety certificate and someone dies, that's a manslaughter claim against you because they've died from the ingestion of gas. It's the same thing for developers. Developers need to be put under scrutiny. You tell me, how is it that a developer is able to put on a lease increasing ground rent to the point where it doubles every year, etc., get away with that nonsense for years on end, and they are not regulated, or they're not reviewed, or put to some sort of independent obligation or accountability if something goes awry? You know, because it is a knock-on effect that the lack of insurance is a whole thing. It's not just about claiming the value of your property. The fact is, if you ever got insurance, that's also a breach of regulation. If you've got a property that you've not insured, you know, it doesn't just affect the building, it affects the neighborhood. So there needs to be sort of an independent regulator, in the same way that banks have ombudsmen, or, you know, the electrical companies have independent regulators. Developers need to be regulated.
We've got immediate reaction to that, Juliet. Dave, who's running along with us here. Regulation is fine, but who's going to police it? Doesn't seem to be enough resources.
But we've got to come up with a solution. Agreed, there aren't enough resources, but that it's not good enough to say that, because as long as these developers are building, then we've got to find a way to get those resources, you know.
We need to hold them to a higher standard. And I'm so glad you made it back in, Steve. So where are you at the moment with your fight? Are you yet got a resolution in sight?
Well, so yeah, I'm sorry about that. I've switched to my mobile. Ironically, even the restart of the router didn't work.
Steve, but, no apologies required. No apologies required. And unfortunately, and that's all we have. Hang on.
Still going on.
You're back again. Right, Steve, launch straight into it, please.
Yeah, so we're basically trying to get some consumer protection legislation to the House of Lords. So what it does is it makes builders joint and severally liable with the lead contractor without the need of courts. It's a quasi-judicial scheme made under the First Tier Tribunal for Appeals. And what it does is it uses RICS qualified adjudicators to take a look at samples, intrusive samples on the facade and on the internal compartmentation. And then if they fail to meet the regulations at the time of construction, then under the power of the legislation, they're then made to remediate in full and to also reimburse any interim measures such as waking watch, 24 fires, fire wardens, and so on. And it's also got the ability to name and shame builders where determinations in the scheme goes against publicly to them. So you could have, and this goes hand in hand with the building safety regulator, which has been put in place for developers for buildings above 18 meters. So as part of their gateways to getting high-risk buildings signed off, they also have to take into account determinations that are against them in our scheme. So this is very short, swift justice without going through the courts in the first instance. There is an appeal to the First Tier Tribunal, But as I said earlier, it's basic stuff. Did you use metal fixings on a fire break? Do you have a fire break at all? Have you got holes in the wall, in the party wall, fire stopping? Really simple stuff, really easy. So if they want to appeal that stuff, good luck to them. They get an appeal once, and then the first tier tribunal will say no forevermore. And we've had that tested by approved inspectors. Obviously, the Earl of Lytton is a conveyancer, a surveyor. So he's also been through it, and we've had a number of fire engineers go through it as well. And we're going to be back in the House of Lords with the Labour government to try and get this through.
Our new friend Dave has jumped in and said warranty insurance only around because the banks and the mortgage providers insist upon this for new builds and conversion products. He's heard of some of the big boys moaning about having to provide it, and they see it as an inconvenience not to protect their customers and ultimately the lender. So there's a cynical point of view. Hamish, will you take us home?
Well, there's very little chance of that happening, really. Until we've heard that. I mean, great thing is, I mean, Steve knows one heck of a lot about this. He's going to need to tell us more, I think, to get it out there in the public domain, and I'm sure he'll come back and speak to us about it.
Absolutely.
However, the challenge is, whilst things are being done for the future, if you like, the most essential thing is, and Juliet reinforced this so seriously, effectively, and what Chris was saying about those poor souls and that particular sort of development area, where, a fire warden walking around, sort of particularly sort of at nights, to ensure this is so damaging. And why are those developers or those responsible for putting those materials in not held to ransom, or they need to be, instead of those people being locked in flats in a danger zone?
Well, we need regulation in this area. I think that's what is absolutely patently clear. And it has to be regulation that is backed up by legislation as well. It's not enough just to wag your finger. We need to be able to slap them on the wrist and punch them on the nose if necessary. It only remains for me to say thank you once again for what was a rousing, fiery issue of Property Quorum. Of course, thank you, Hamish McLay, Chris Gilsenan of Route Home, Juliet Baboolal of gunnercooke, and thank you very much for visiting us today, Steve. I hope you come back again in future. What a fascinating story. What a fascinating story you have. And we all wish you much luck with your fight. And let's hope you come out on top, not just for yourself, but for all others who are suffering this horrendousness. All I would say to everyone listening is we at Property Quorum do not provide advice. We are simply here to give opinion and to draw attention to things that perhaps aren't so talked about within property. But we're here every week at 10 o'clock or around that time on a Thursday, and we'd love it if you'd attend with us. Very soon, the whole lot are being issued onto YouTube. We're going to have a separate channel for it, and hopefully there'll be a bunch of advertising around that. And thank you very much, Dave. Great chat. Loved this. Great. Dave, if you liked it, tell your friends. Tell your enemies. I don't care.
So we need to have him along, Dave. Get in touch with us, Dave.
Absolutely. Dave, please get in touch specifically with Hamish McLay or myself, and or any of the team, and we'll see if we can get you on. But until next week, keep your feet on the ground, keep reaching for the stars, look after that mental health, and I hope you have a wonderful weekend. Bye-bye now.